so I decided to take a drive a few blocks over to go visit it, and there was just this creepiness about this house and eeriness. You were being watched by someone or something. It was said that the slaughters began at 3:15 a.m. In those days following my visit to that home, I began unexplainably waking up at 3:15 every night, and I would see what I thought were shadows on the walls of my home.
There is an unwritten code in Brooklyn. You don't tell anyone else's stories, and you don't talk about anyone else's business. Every story I tell is mine. Locations, names, and specific details have all been changed to honor that code. This is Brooklyn Files, the real stories.
Everyone became familiar with the Amityville Horror in the 1970s. No matter what corner of the planet you're from, you immediately know the name Amityville. There was this entire franchise built around the legendary home in Amityville, Long Island. Amityville is a quiet middle-class suburb on Long Island, a town that's just about 34 miles from where I grew up in Brooklyn. At first, there were murders in the home. A 23-year-old car mechanic who worked at his grandfather's family-owned car dealership. He went room to room, horrifically and systematically shooting to death his 4 siblings and both his parents late one night in November of 1974. The next day, he confessed to the murders. It was right before the holidays, too, ironically, so you can sadly see in the aftermath photos and videos some of the Halloween decorations that still haven't been taken down, and this large Dutch colonial-style home, it's just dotted with hints of Thanksgiving and the fall season. So you got pumpkin decorations here, a cornucopia there, and all signs of a holiday that they would never live to celebrate, sadly. After the tragic killings, then came the hauntings over a little bit over a year later, 13 months to be exact. And that part all first came to light when a family of 5 consisting of a father, a mother, and their 3 children, they fled that same home after only 28 days of living in it, and claiming that countless horrifying experiences, some that would give anybody nightmares, took place in that house. Following that, the Amityville killings and the hauntings, well, that sparked countless books and movies, and that became a subcategory within itself for true crime buffs and horror enthusiasts. So you could still find lots of movies on that topic, but it became personal for me from a very early age, as I would have more than one close encounter with the killer's son and would later be stalked by that same evil spirit after an encounter with the infamous home later in my adult years. So the first time I heard about the Amityville killings was when I was 5 years old. I was at Thanksgiving dinner just 2 weeks after the slayings. We were at my aunt's house out on Long Island. So we were like only a handful of miles from the actual murder home. And I remember being a bit traumatized when my aunt, like making dinner conversation, she says something like, "Did you hear about the family that were killed by the son?" And then she goes on to say, like, we knew them, they were a nice family, and like we bought a couple of cars from their dealership. Like we did business with them in Brooklyn over the years. Then she says they only lived a handful of miles from here. So hearing that as a 5-year-old, as you could imagine, that was like a really shocking concept. Like to me, murder was a thing that strangers did to each other. Like, you mean a young man would actually kill his relatives? Like, who could ever do that? So that left a massive impression on me, not a good one. And that would end up staying with me the rest of my life. But the next encounter with this tragic story would come even closer to me and would leave an even bigger imprint on my life. So back in those days, I would go to an elementary school that just so happened to be not too far from that dealership where the dad from the family was slain, worked at, selling cars for his father-in-law, The son who would eventually be convicted for the murders also worked at this Brooklyn dealership as well, and it happened to be owned by his grandfather. And he was a mechanic there, so the father and son worked for the family-owned dealership together. So rewind to that same year of the slayings. It was months before this Thanksgiving dinner where I'd first heard about this tragic event, and I was in kindergarten at the time. So to get to my school, my mom and I, we would take 2 buses to get there. We would take one bus, then transfer to the next, and on this second bus stop where we would stand, it was diagonal from the dealership, like catty corner. At the time, we had no way of knowing who this strange man was, but clear as day, I remember my mom would point out to me this man that we would see each morning around the same time, and we would be waiting for that second bus, and he'd just be wearing his coveralls, and like most car mechanics wear, and he would appear to be like taking a little bit of a cigarette break out in front of the dealership on this corner, and he would always give us like these creepy smiles as if he was like kind of taunting us. It was weird. So my mom would actually tell me to turn the other way. She'd say something like, "There's that weird guy, don't look at him, like look the other way." And I remember like being frightened by that. Day in, day out, we see this strange man standing on the corner outside the car dealership, smoking his cigarettes and just giving us this strange look. It almost felt as if he was timing his smoking breaks every day, knowing that we would be out there and he wanted to taunt us or something, but we could only speculate. It wasn't until after the murders and after that one Thanksgiving dinner where I'd first learned about the killings that we were home one night and we're watching TV, and one of those like news shows comes on, and they happen to be talking about the progress of that case, about the tragedy that took place in that Long Island home only a month prior. And that's when we made this shocking connection. We're sitting down in the living room and we're watching TV, and right there, plain as day on our TV screen, they're showing some file footage of the man that was accused of killing his family, and it was the man that we'd seen on the street corner, time and time again, peering at us, like while he would smoke his cigarettes and give us those bizarre smiles. It was pretty hard to believe that we had that type of a close encounter with the killer himself, but my mom and I were sure that was the same guy. In fact, my mother was the one who started yelling at the TV screen when she saw him. She yelled something like, "Oh my God, that's the guy." So fast forward to about 30 years later, it's now 2004. My mom, because she had some health issues and with some age, she was unable to carry out her daily activities on her own without some assistance. So she ended up in an assisted living facility. It was called Grace Cove, run by a church. And this organization was out on Long Island, and it was in a town called Islip. So my mom, she's able to get admitted to this group home, and at the time, I was living in Pennsylvania. By now, I had a family of my own, one small child and a newborn at home. And at the time, I was working in Midtown Manhattan, and on weekends, every couple of months, I would go out to visit my mom on Long Island. Well, one day, my mom calls, and she tells me that they're planning on renovating the home that she's in, and she's gonna temporarily be relocated to a different home, possibly for a couple of months or so. So the next thing she tells me is that this home that she's being relocated to is in Amityville. So first thing that comes to mind is the obvious, that she's going to be in the same town as the famous creepy house. A week or so goes by, she finally moves into this new place. My mom gives me the address of the new home, and I look it up, and of course, it's 3 blocks away from the infamous murder home. After she was moved to that house in Amityville, she was attacked by another woman in that home, like unprovoked. There was another incident where she swore she'd been pushed down the stairs by an unseen hand, and she was walking down the stairs. She felt this hand just grab her shoulder and push her. And it was early in the morning, so no one else was on that stairwell. In fact, mostly everyone was still asleep. She probably got a brain injury or something, or concussion from that. Once she was in this home though, her Bible got stolen, Things went missing, her money was stolen. She was not having an easy time in that house. And it almost felt like there was a spirit that was following her, or something inside this house just 3 blocks from the murder home. Almost like something was in the midst of this neighborhood that was causing all of these events to happen. So, of course, a couple of weeks after my mom moved to this group home in Amityville, I eventually decided to go visit her, and we spent the day together. And my mom was telling me throughout the entire day, like how she just didn't like that home, like she couldn't wait to leave, and she just didn't like the things that were going on. She got this really creepy feeling in the pit of her stomach being in this house. She always felt like there was something dark going on there. And it was just a few blocks away, as I said, from the infamous Amityville house. So the same day after that visit with my mom, I was curious. So I decided to take a drive a few blocks over to go visit it. So I pull up to the house, and the street was empty, and I just sat there outside the house for a good 15 minutes, just checking it out, taking in the vibe. And there was just this creepiness about this house and eeriness. Like you couldn't help but to feel that, like when you were sitting out on the street in front of this house, that you were being watched by someone or something. Like you just felt this pair of eyes that you couldn't see that were on you. And you couldn't explain this uneasy feeling. So after sitting outside this house for a while, I decided to head back to Pennsylvania to my home and go spend the evening with my family. So I did that. Now this was where things started to get really personal and really weird and very scary for me. So there's a couple of things that you have to know first. First, when the son went on his killing spree the night of November 13th, it was said that the slaughters began at 3:15 a.m. After the second family that fled the home moved from the home, after the 28 days, among the many horrifying things that they revealed that they experienced was that the father of the family kept waking up at 3:15 a.m. himself, and he would get insanely overwhelming feelings like he was losing his mind, like something was overcoming him, and he felt like he was losing control. In those days following my visit to that home, I began unexplainably waking up at 3:15 every night, and I would see what I thought were shadows on the walls of my home. Like I was kind of losing my mind myself. It was as if the Amityville spirit was like now following me. I felt like I was losing my mind. And here's another important detail that you have to know. After the murders and after the hauntings, it was said that the home in Amityville was built on some ancient Native American burial grounds. Well, historical and archaeological research had widely debunked that claim, but according to some accounts, the land was used by one tribe as a place to keep the sick and dying. So on those nights that I would wake up at 3:15 a.m. in my home in Pennsylvania, I found that I couldn't go back to sleep. I would go down to my basement and I would play video games on the computer, or I'd watch a little TV. On numerous occasions, I would have to stop what I was doing because I would hear something coming from outside the pitch black backyard late at night, and I would hear the sound of Native American chanting with a drum and like a rattle sound. It would come and go. It would start low, get a little louder, and then get lower, and then silent. It would just come and go. And after that experience, I started to do a little research, a little digging around, and what I would soon find made my blood run cold. So after digging, I found that the land that we had built our home on in Pennsylvania and the surrounding region, it was the historical homeland of the Lenape people. The historical records and archaeological evidence confirm the presence of villages, settlements, and burial grounds in that area. So I couldn't honestly help but to connect the dots and think that there was something to that. Now, this is where the story gets even more personal. I mean, like, we're talking about a really close connection to the original murders that happened in that house that night. After finding out all that I did up to this point, from researching everything after returning home, from visiting that house that one day, I then begin going down the rabbit hole, as the saying goes. Have you ever gotten pretty obsessed with something so much that you started to research it, that you go deep into the layers, you start finding out things that blew your mind? Well, I started to research everything that happened That night, when the family of 6 was murdered by the son, the night that he shot the family, he apparently left the house, got in the car, put the weapon and the dirty clothing that he took off in the car, drove them all the way to Brooklyn. The presumption is that he did this so that the murder weapon and the clothing could not be found and connected to him. Well, he apparently dumped the gun in the water along with the spent cartridges, and then he stuffs the bloody clothing that he'd been wearing in a sewer on a quiet street in Brooklyn in the wee hours of the morning. Ironically, but maybe intentionally, the exit that he got off of from the highway from Long Island was one of the first exits that you come to when you're driving from Long Island into Brooklyn, some 29 miles away from his home. When I did my digging and researching everything, it all came to a dead stop when I realized how close he hid his bloody clothing to where I'd been that very morning. So after digging and going down the rabbit hole, I go and find that in the wee hours of the morning of the killings, the 23-year-old son drove into Brooklyn and he got off one of the first exits in Brooklyn, and this happened to be the same exit where my kindergarten class was. So he proceeded to take the exit, go up to the next major intersection. He pulls his car over right at the same corner of my morning kindergarten class. So we're talking like maybe 200 feet maximum from the very front door where I would be dropped off later that very morning. The killer came and disposed of the bloody clothing he'd been wearing during that atrocious act that would soon echo around the world, right there in the sewer drain, diagonally across the very intersection of my school entrance. Based on the established police timeline of events, it would have been around 6 o'clock a.m. when the killer would have arrived to that corner diagonally across from my morning class. That year, my classes began at 8:30 a.m. That would have separated me from the killer by 2.5 hours at the very intersection where he dumped the blood-splattered clothing. Later that morning, after dumping the evidence, the 23-year-old son went straight to his job at the dealership where my mom and I would see him each morning. He later went back to Amityville after his workday. He then entered a local pub where he claimed to have discovered his family dead in the home, and he later confessed to the entire crime that next day. After details of his story didn't add up, he told police where he dumped the gun and the clothing across from my school. After that 2-month period of my mom being in that temporary home in Amityville, she returned to her regular home finally, where her life started to actually return to normal. No more things getting stolen from her, no more fights or being pushed downstairs. As for my encounters in that house in Pennsylvania, I never did get to the bottom of those sounds that I would hear when I'd be in the basement late at night, but I definitely heard them. And as for Amityville, I no longer have a reason to go back to that town, nor do I have any desire.